This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
This morning we are talking about the differences between self-preservation and self-care. We are looking at why our young people may be entering self-preservation mode, particularly as we are in the exam season, and what we can do to help them through it.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
A very good morning to you. It is Saturday the 17th of May 2025. This is the Saturday Breakfast Show with me, your host, Darren Lester. This is 7th time lucky for this particular show. So hopefully you can hear me this week. You may have noticed, if you are a friend of the show, if you try and come along live at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning, or if you like to listen back, maybe at some point during the week, you may have noticed that there was no show from me last week, and there was supposed to be. In fact, it was this very show that I was planning on doing with you, but it just was not meant to be. I think Podbean, where we host it, doesn't like when I take a week off. I think this is what I have decided, because I had kind of deliberately taken the week before last off, as a self-care measure, which we'll talk about in a little while. Then I came back last week, kind of ready and raring to go, having done a live show the Tuesday before the Saturday, and that all went perfectly fine. But yeah, last Saturday was a bit of a disaster, and I still to this day do not know. Well, to this day, a week later, makes it sound like my life is some kind of epic timeline, whereas in fact all I've done this week is teach. But yeah, a week later, I still haven't actually figured out what went wrong with it, to the extent that I was a bit nervous this morning, kind of starting the show up, because I haven't changed anything about the setup. I thought, you know what, I will just leave it. I have the same setup every single week. I physically don't actually know how to alter my setup particularly. So I thought, you know what, we'll just see what happens. So hopefully I am live. Well, no, I know that I'm live because I've got my little clock in the corner ticking. Hopefully you can hear me, and I haven't just spent the last 3.5 minutes talking to myself. But we are here. But actually, what happened last Saturday morning is quite a good lead into what I want to talk about today, which is this difference between self-care and self-preservation. Tim has texted in, good morning to you, loud and clear. Good. I am very glad to hear it. Not that I would mind sitting here and just chatting to myself for an hour and a half. As teachers, that is quite often how our life feels, like we just sit and talk to ourselves. So I'm used to that, but it is always quite nice if everyone else can join in. And if you would like to join in the conversation this morning, of course you can. If you are listening live via Podbean, you can text in. There we go. That's what I was trying to say. Just as Tim has done, you can text straight into the Podbean app. I will read your message out on air and we can engage that way. If you are listening live elsewhere, it is actually now harder to get in touch with me. So if you used to follow my social media, you will know that not too long ago, or if you listened actually to the Pocket Talk show that James and I hosted last week, last Tuesday, you will know that I had some of my data scraped. So I kind of, one of my strands of my jobs is writing. I write lots of resources for teachers. I write lots of kind of blog posts and how-tos for teachers, and I write fiction. I like to dabble in all sorts of things. And there was a particular website that I tend to use for my writing as a repository, just as a way to kind of store it and to make it available for people. And we had an email maybe about 3 weeks ago now that said that this particular repository had been scraped. So somebody had been through, used some kind of algorithm. I'm not a particularly techie person, so I don't really understand how they did it. They used some kind of algorithm to basically just take all of the data, all of the writing that was hosted on this site, turn it into a torrent file, and uploaded it with the intention of the torrent being downloaded to be able to be fed into generative AI programs. And if I'm very honest, I felt violated by that. That the work that I had put in, the words that I had put out there for free to benefit other people, had been taken and was being used to train the generative AI so that then others could take my words and claim them as their own. I felt it was a very odd kind of physical, visceral reaction to getting that news. I did not like it. So I still haven't decided whether I overreacted. But essentially what I did was I shut down all of my front-facing everything. So at this point, there is nothing publicly accessible that I have created online unless I've been compensated for it, unless I've been paid for it, or unless I've been given something in exchange. I currently don't have anything out there that I have done for free. And that included kind of shutting down my social media, because I liked to use my X account. I liked to use my Blue Sky account to kind of point people towards things that I'd done or towards talks that I was giving and that sort of thing. I still haven't yet decided what I'm going to do. I'm going to take some time over this summer to come up with kind of a new strategy. I've got a couple of ideas. I've been looking at ways of making my work scraper resistant. I don't think these days, unfortunately, you can make anything scraper proof. People have realized that they can make money by stealing other people's words and selling it on to these generative companies. And so I think now any of us who make things publicly available online for free, whether that is, those of us in the teaching profession who like to share resources or worksheets or that sort of thing, writers who like to kind of post drabbles and shorts online as a way of directing people to their published works, artists who create and upload to sites. We are all at risk these days of having our data stolen and sold in a way that is much more blatant than it ever was before, and in ways that can be used to not necessarily harm us, but that can be used to lift other people off the back of our work, which just to me is a bit ethically weird. Which is not to say that I am abjectly anti-AI in all forms. I understand that there are people who consent to having their work used to train generative AI. I understand that not all AI is generative. I understand that lots of companies, they train their AI on ethically sourced data. But what I think is important, and what I think we all have to do, kind of in this world that has changed much faster than any of us was anticipating, is to make sure that we actually understand how this stuff works. We understand how our data is potentially being mined. We decide whether we consent to that or not. And we just make our own informed choices, as we do for everything. That was a very long story, just to tell you that you can no longer get in touch with me via X and Blue Sky, wasn't it? So, as I was saying, about 5 minutes ago, before I went off on that tangent, if you would like to engage, then doing so via Podbean is your best bet. So do drop live into the room, and you can text me and we can have a chat about this concept of self-care and self-preservation, which is our topic for today.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads. No distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering math circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
So-called stuck schools will be held accountable even if support brokered for them by the government RISE teams fails to turn them around, according to a report in Schools Week. Speaking at the Schools and Academies show, Department for Education Director General John Edwards said, "The current responsible body, the Schools Trust or Council, is accountable for the improvement. It owns the improvement journey." He went on to say that this starting principle had been really important for Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson. Earlier this month, 45 new advisors were appointed to join the 20 already appointed in RISE teams. The expanded team will start working with more than 200 schools deemed stuck for receiving a requires improvement Ofsted grade following an earlier below good judgment. When the government initially unveiled plans for the RISE teams, there was confusion around accountability. But slides shown during the presentation by Mr. Edwards indicate that once a school becomes eligible for support, the RISE teams will assess its capacity to improve. Where a school needs help, it will be matched with a high-quality organisation and considered for funded intervention. An improvement plan would then be co-constructed. Edwards went on to say the RISE advisor's job is not to deliver the improvement. The BBC Education section of their news website reports that private school fees were 22.6% higher on average in January this year when compared with a year earlier. This is according to the body that represents most independent schools in the UK, the Independent Schools Council. It says it expects a reduction in pupils applying to private schools as a result of changes to VAT. But it says it is too soon to know the full effects of the policy. The average termly fee for a day school in January was £7,382, which includes 20% VAT. In January 2024, the average was £6,021. A Treasury spokesperson says the increase in fees are not only down to VAT, and that fees have been rising in private schools over the last 25 years. The ISC said many schools were able to reduce their fees, excluding VAT, in January to cushion the impact on parents. But ISC Chief Executive Julie Robinson said the sector had been hit by a triple whammy of national insurance changes, an end to charitable business rates relief, and 20% VAT on fees. Full details of the report can be found online. SEND is also in the news from Schools Week as it covers further updates from the Schools and Academies show. This time the report says officials are considering a shake-up of the Education Health and Care Plan system that would likely lead to a narrowing or new structure of support. Speaking to Schools Week, Dame Christine Lenihan added that discussions were ongoing about whether EHCPs should only apply to special school pupils. The number of EHCPs has increased rapidly in recent years, from 294,758 in 2020 to 434,354 in 2024. And schools and other services have struggled to keep up with demand. In March, a Schools Week investigation exposed the poor quality of many plans. The government is drawing up reforms to the wider SEND sector, with speculation the whole system of EHCPs could be scrapped. Dame Christine, the government's strategic advisor on SEND, responded to questions about the EHCP system by saying it's not fit for purpose. And when asked if she envisaged there being fewer EHCPs, she said, "I think probably so." She went on to say, "I see the huge amount of money we put on statutory assessment, and then I look at the translation into schools and it is not working." Further comment and reaction can be found on Schools Week online. Finally, BBC Tees reports on the success of a cafe in Hartlepool that has been giving young people who struggle with school a different way of learning vital life skills. The cafe opened in November 2024 and is set up for takeaway orders. There is a chef and a number of students who learn food hygiene, health and safety, customer service and how to cook. Children are referred by their schools and English and maths are also studied. Young people attending the provision say, "I've grown and developed a lot. It's changed me completely." Whilst the cafe's co-director says, "There is a no negativity rule and praise is very important." Full details of the positive impact of this alternative provision can be found on BBC Tees website. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Thank you, Joe. Really interesting as always. I'm particularly interested in the EHCP discussion because I think while I appreciate when people sort of review these procedures, these policies that have become normal in teaching, and feel that they're not working, they seek to change them. I don't think that the right answer is making sure that EHCPs are only given to children who are in special schools, because that kind of, it seems to me like it's a step backwards. I remember when mainstreaming became part of the strategy for schools. I wasn't a teacher at that point. I was still in school. But I remember being in the news about how we were going to see increasing numbers of children with special educational needs going into mainstream classrooms and accessing mainstream education in a way that they hadn't before, because the instinct, I suppose, would have been to put them into a school which was designed to meet their specific needs. And the idea, I think, behind it was to ensure that those children developed the skills to function in everyday society, and made sure that they learned the adaptability and they learned what they needed to do in order to make sure that their lives were not worsened when they went out into the wide world after school, and also to make sure that the children who would have been in the mainstream schools anyway learn that not everybody is able to function in the same way within society, and that it's important and right to make accommodations for certain people. And so it seems to me that if EHCPs are only going to be given to children who are in special schools, then the children who are in mainstream schools but need an EHCP, they are more likely then to be removed and put into a special school, which means that we will be back to where we were however many years ago that the mainstreaming started to happen. I think it was around the time that I did my work experience, so it would have been 25-ish years ago, I suppose. So yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I appreciate when we recognize that things aren't working and when we understand that something needs to change, but I'm not sure that a regression is always the right answer. I think, once again, it's about looking at the system and thinking, okay, if the system isn't working for all of our children, maybe that's the thing that needs to change, instead of creating two separate systems in the hopes that they each will work for everybody. Right, we are on self-care and self-preservation today. This was planned a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember what prompted it. I actually went back through my show notes to see if I could figure out what I was thinking about, or what I talked about to somebody that prompted this one being a timely topic, but I couldn't find it, because I do like to kind of ground my topics. I do think it's important for us to know where everything that we think about comes from. But yeah, I couldn't find it. But what I did find quite interesting, and again, probably just because I knew that this topic was coming up, so I was kind of looking for links where maybe I'd ignored them before, was I was teaching a Year 7 class yesterday. We were doing source work about historical sources. We were talking about validity, reliability, and bias. And one of the children brought up a lot of the chat that was happening during COVID-19 lockdowns. And, we were talking about how when eventually that time becomes a historical time period, when it's something that children study in school, they will find that there will be lots of competing primary sources, because everybody had a different opinion about what was going on. Everybody thought that they knew what the right thing to do was. And, all of that will have been recorded. So future generations of children, I think, will have easier access to primary sources kind of than our current generation of children does when we are looking at historical time periods. And the reason I kind of mention that is because the research that I have looked at for today's session, today's show, sorry, I was kind of in teacher mode at that point, remembering yesterday's lesson. The research that I've looked at for today's show does come from the early days of the pandemic. And I find this quite interesting, actually, that in 2020 and in 2021, there was a lot of research conducted very, very quickly into the concept of self-preservation and self-care. Whenever I've talked about self-care on the show before, a lot of the studies that I've drawn from were conducted during that time. Not because they were conducted during the pandemic, but just because they were recent. And so I think that in itself is worth thinking about and is worth discussing at some point, not right now, and not on this show, because this isn't what we're talking about today. But I think this idea that there's a lot of research that is conducted as emergencies are happening, but very little preventative research is done. We didn't think to do research into how we might benefit from self-preservation and self-care in a pandemic before the pandemic happened. And I wonder how much research is being done into self-preservation and self-care now, kind of in preparation for where there might be a potential pandemic in the future, or whether we're just kind of leaving that alone now and we're moving on to whatever the current crisis is. So I think, whenever we look at research, I look at research a lot, both for my doctorate and for MFL Journal Club. And I think, whenever we look at the research, it is very important for us to understand the context in which the research was being conducted, because that will inevitably skew not necessarily the data, but how the data were interpreted. And as we then go on to interpret the study, to interpret the findings, that is really important, I think, for us to think about. So, yeah, today's show, I'm kind of weaving together two seemingly disparate studies, but into something that I feel is quite cohesive, to look at this difference between self-care and self-preservation, and then to think about where they are each needed, why they are each important, and how we can make sure we are balancing the two within our own lives. Because let's be honest, self-preservation, it sounds quite harsh, doesn't it? I didn't want to call it that when I was planning the show. I thought, there's got to be a softer term for it. There's got to be something, some kind of euphemism that I can couch it in. But then I thought, well, actually, if we're always couching this idea of self-preservation and we're always reading these negative connotations into it, it's always going to feel like a negative thing. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk about self-preservation. I'm going to talk about self-care, and we're going to talk about how they're different. And yeah, that's the plan for today. So, of the two studies that I've chosen to discuss, one of them looked specifically at mindfulness and how mindfulness can help anxious children and their anxious adults to manage their own mental health. And then the second one looked at the socio-demographic challenges that shape people's ability to adopt self-protective behaviors. So, we're not looking at the very trite self-care activities that I've kind of railed against on the show before. If you don't listen to Saturday Morning Breakfast very often, I do talk about self-care quite a lot because I think it's very important. So this is about how we can make sure that self-care and self-preservation are equitable, how we can make sure our young people maintain their agency, and how we can make sure that we navigate survival during difficult times, which, like I've said, I think is quite pertinent right now as we are in the midst of exam season, how we can make sure that we navigate that with integrity. So let's talk about the difference between self-care and self-preservation, because I think it is very important to distinguish between the two and to understand why they are both important. Self-care refers to these deliberate actions that we take to maintain our physical, emotional, and mental health. So when self-care gets bandied around social media spaces, it tends to be, bath bombs and bubble baths. And there's a lot about bathing when it comes to self-care. People talk about candles, people talk about indulgent foods. Quite often self-care can, if we just take a social media lens, it can look like spiraling into self-indulgence. And we've got to be very careful when we think about self-care that we're not conflating it with self-indulgence, that we're not kind of setting ourselves up for failure or for future hardship by engaging in behaviors that we know we shouldn't be engaging in. Self-preservation, on the other hand, is much more primal. It's about keeping yourself safe, just the act of being safe in real or perceived threats. And I think it's the idea of a perceived threat that is going to be very pertinent to us today. There are memes that go around. I see them quite a lot, particularly around anxiety, which are things like, how do I tell my brain that writing this email isn't going to kill me? How do I tell my brain that answering the phone isn't going to put me in any kind of mortal danger? There are these kind of daily life things that quite often we feel are a threat to our safety, a threat to our well-being, a threat to our ability to survive. And perception is powerful. So just because replying to the email, answering the phone won't necessarily kill you, it doesn't mean that it doesn't feel that way. And for lots of people, it can feel that way. And so self-preservation is about tackling that threat as the very real threat that you perceive it to be. And I think it's very important when we think about self-preservation, and this is another reason why I didn't want to couch the idea in euphemisms. I think it's very important that we don't belittle or underestimate the impact that perception of different activities can have on people. And, depending on where different people are on the anxiety scale, these things can feel like very real mortal threats. And telling somebody to calm down, telling somebody that no, answering the phone won't kill you, it doesn't take that away. So in that case, with that definition of self-preservation, we need to kind of really look at what those differences are, because quite often, again, when you're feeling anxious, when you are feeling worried, self-care tends to be what people advocate. Go and have a nice calming cup of tea. go and watch something for 30 minutes, then come back to the computer and answer the email when you've calmed down a little bit. But that doesn't help if the person you're talking to perceives the activity that they have to do as a literal life or death situation. And, if we think about our young people at the moment during exam time, that is quite often how they will see the exams that they are about to go and sit. As teachers, we know full well that the moment our year 11s or our year 13s walk out of the exam hall, their exam paper becomes a past paper. And it kind of, to us, it downgrades in importance. We know full well that if our year 11s, or to be fair, our year 13s, if they don't do as well on their exams as they might have done, they can always retake them. But it doesn't feel that way when you are in it. It doesn't feel that way when you are waiting outside of the exam hall with your transparent pencil case and your water bottle, hoping that you've got enough black pens to write the thousands of words that you plan on writing for your English literature essay. And so, again, I think it's very important right now that we remember how our young people might be feeling, how they are perceiving what they are about to go and do on a daily basis, and in some cases, a 2 or 3 times daily basis. One of my own students last week had, I think it was English literature and then 2 Mandarin exams all on the same day. So, it's a lot that they have to go through. And it's important for us to remember that and make sure that we are giving them the advice and the kind of practical self-care, self-preservation tips that are actually going to be useful to them. So the 2 studies that we're looking at today come from, like I've said, 2020 and 2021 respectively. And while they seem quite disparate on the surface, I kind of feel like by combining them, we are able to offer quite an interesting lens into how inner strategies and external realities shape our ability to protect and care for ourselves. So the first study is from 2020. It was a qualitative study on mindfulness interventions for anxious children and their parents. Then the second one is a 2021 empirical study that was conducted in the US that looks at how socio-demographic factors influenced self-protective behaviors. And again, both of these contextualized within the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, kind of when everything that society was doing was kind of a gut reaction, an instinctual reaction to what was going on around us. The mindfulness study showed that it's possible for children to learn to be with their anxiety. And I quite liked that phrase, be with. They learned not to fight their anxiety, but to observe it. And this is very much a core tenet of mindfulness practices. You don't try and pretend that your concerns are not there. You don't try and fool yourself into thinking that you are not anxious about something, that you're not worried about something. You learn to accept it as a natural feeling that your brain produces. The children were taught breathing techniques. They were taught to identify their thoughts, to be very deliberate, to be metacognitive almost in their own thinking. And they were taught grounding exercises. And it was found in this study that a combination of those 3 different things were the key to helping to reduce the stress related to anxiety. So it's not about reducing anxiety itself, because that's kind of fighting it, which goes against the whole point of this study. But it was about making sure that you can cope with it, making sure that it doesn't take a bigger toll on your well-being than it actually needs to. And what this study found was that these skills that the children were being taught, the breathing exercises, the grounding, the identifying thoughts, they translated into more agency and into fewer emotional outbursts. Now, we know that children, particularly very young children, are not very good at regulating their feelings. Young children cry because that's the way they know to deal with the very big feelings that they are feeling. So by teaching them, by actively going through, this is what you're feeling, this is how you can name it, identify it, and this then is how you can deal with it. By giving them those skills, we are able to give them more agency in terms of having control, having ownership over their own feelings and how they respond to it. Because a secondary emotion that comes with those emotional outbursts is embarrassment. Young children, when they burst into tears over not knowing who they're going to sit with at lunch, they don't want to do that. They kind of know that that's not how people generally behave. And particularly if they draw attention to themselves from their peers, they will start to feel embarrassed about it, which then leads to, or can lead to, a shame spiral in terms of your own emotions, their own emotions. So they can have agency over their feelings, over control of their feelings, over making sure that they don't spiral. And they can feel empowered. And ultimately, that's what self-care is. Self-care is about empowerment. It's about building your own resilience from the inside out. And we talk, again, in education, we talk a lot about resilience. And we talk about whether or not our children are resilient. But quite often we do so without teaching them these kind of mindfulness tools that will build the resilience. Or where we do teach them, I've noticed it tends to be as an intervention. So we tend to make sure that the children who are less resilient, who are more prone to emotional outbursts, who feel more frequently emotionally dysregulated, they are taught the mindfulness techniques. But the children who are better at controlling their emotions, they don't tend to be taught them, because it doesn't always look like they need them. But the problem with that is when those children then have the emotional outburst, because it happens, everybody feels overwhelmed, everybody at times feels unable to control their emotions. It's bigger. And let's be realistic, there are quite often more severe consequences to that, both because it's a bigger outburst, because that child reaches a specific breaking point before they break, their breaking point is higher, and so the feelings are more intense and how they react to them are more intense, and they haven't had these experiences of not being able to deal with their feelings before, so they don't know what to do. So then there are more consequences to it, because perhaps they lash out in a more extreme way. And perhaps there are more consequences because the adult giving the sanction is quite shocked because, oh, that's not like them. And what happens to that poor child is that they are sanctioned for having their feelings. They are sanctioned for feeling their feelings, or at least they feel like they are being sanctioned for feeling their feelings. And that has all happened because no one ever taught them how to regulate themselves, because their whole lives it has been believed that they knew how to do it, whereas in fact they just had a higher threshold for whatever it was going to take to push them over the edge. So I think that teaching our young people, and let's be honest, teaching our older people, I think a lot of us as adults could do with learning some of these techniques. I know that I don't always use all of the techniques that I have learned through the kind of library of self-help books that I read and the therapy that I went through when I was diagnosed with my anxiety. I don't use all of them because they don't all work for me, but I do use a lot of them. And when I look back, I think, oh, I wonder how certain key points in my life might have been different if I had been taught how to do this. So, focusing on emotional regulation, focusing on self-care, focusing on teaching people how to be with their anxiety. It's not just good for our young people, but it's good for us as well.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads, no distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering math circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
One of the other reasons that it's really important for us to kind of offer these mindfulness techniques to all children is the sense of community that it can build. One of the most profound findings from the 2020 study into children dealing with anxiety through mindfulness techniques was how much they valued this concept of community. They reported, the young people who were interviewed reported that just being around others who had anxiety, or who they perceived to have anxiety, was itself very healing because it normalized their own experience and it reduced the shame that they felt in it. Now, adults need this too. It's very important for us to have this. My closest friend also has depression and anxiety. He is on, I think it's the same medication as me. Fairly sure it's the same one. We don't start every single text conversation that we have, "Hello, my name is Darren and I have anxiety and depression. How are you this morning?" But just knowing that you have that thing in common, knowing that somebody else understands what you are going through, it's really important, and it's normalizing so that you don't have to say at the beginning of every conversation, "This is what I have." It's important because you know that they know that if you leave them on red for a couple of days, it's not because you're ignoring them, but it's because you're not feeling very well. It's so that you can say things like, oh, tomorrow morning, could you just send me a text to remind me to go and pick up my meds while I'm in town? To kind of help you remember, in the same way that you might say, oh, tomorrow morning, could you just text me to remind me that I need olive oil while I'm in town? So that normalization is very, very important. And as adults, we can seek that out. Now, again, he and I didn't meet because we have anxiety and depression. In fact, we met because we both love stationery. And stationery is a good cure for anxiety and depression. Let's just be very clear about that. But if we want to, we can seek out those spaces in person, online, wherever it may be. It could be a very formal support group, or it could just be an informal happenstance gathering. Children can't do that. Children don't have the agency to do that. Let's be honest. They can't consent to joining an online group. They, below the age of 13, they shouldn't even have accounts to a whole range of social media sites. And so they kind of need that community created for them. And by having everybody in their classroom learn these techniques, and by being very explicit without naming them, but by saying, such a percentage, I don't know the exact numbers, but such a percentage of people have anxiety, and I'm going to teach you some techniques that they use to deal with that. Everybody gets worried about things from time to time, and when you're feeling worried, these are some things that you can do. It creates that normalized space, and it creates that sense of cohesion among all of the young people. So I think we need to remember that these intervention strategies, even group intervention strategies, are not a luxury. We shouldn't be seeing them as something that we can offer because we have the extra budget. So, let's put this in place. They can quite often be lifelines for our young people. And so they should be put in place anyway. They should just be a working part of our day, whether it is an intervention group or whether it is part of your life skills curriculum, or whatever it could be. In the second study, something quite interesting that came up was the unequal burden of keeping safe. So income, work flexibility, and housing conditions were huge predicators of whether people could adopt specific protective behaviors, even the very simple ones like social distancing. We know, with the benefit of hindsight, that it tended to be the lower income individuals who faced greater job loss, whose jobs didn't allow remote working, didn't allow for teleworking. Supermarkets couldn't be stocked by somebody working from home. They had to be stocked by somebody working in the supermarket. Factories couldn't be cleaned by somebody working from home. They had to be cleaned by the person going into the factory. And again, quite often those jobs provided and continue to provide less access to outdoor space. So less access to ventilation, less access to the ability to keep away from other people. And that started to raise very interesting, although ethically uncomfortable questions about exactly what we were valuing. Because we were still expecting a lot of people to go out to work. We were still expecting shop assistants to be there so that the rest of us could go and do our grocery shopping. And, things were put into place, protective barriers were put into place, masks were worn, all of that stuff happened. But the mere fact that we were still expecting those people to go into work, that we were kind of expecting them to put their job over their own protection, their own preservation, does raise some questions, like I've just said, about exactly what we value and exactly what we expect other people to value. What was interesting is that the highest predictor of self-preservation was actually income. Remember, this was in the US. This study took place in the US, so it's specifically within that context. But having read it, I do think kind of anecdotally it can apply to the UK as well. People who were in the highest income quintile were found to be 13 to 19% more likely to increase their self-protective behaviors. I don't even need to ask the question why, because the answer to that is very obvious. They had options. They were in professions that allowed them to stay home. They were in professions that allowed them to afford delivery. They could afford to have the supermarkets drop off their food. They could afford those delivery fees. They could afford to avoid risky environments. They were maybe the people that already had high-speed internet at home, so they could very easily organize Zoom parties and meetings with family and all of that sort of thing, without having to have any extra outlay. They may have already had enough computers at home for all of the adults to be able to work from home. Their children may have already had tablets or their own computers through which they could do the homeschooling. So they were able very quickly to adapt to that. I was very able to quickly adapt to that. I don't think I'm in the highest income quintile because, in case the title of the show hasn't made it clear, I'm a teacher. I don't think we are in the highest quintile. But, I do have, and I have had for a long time, high-speed internet because, we like the internet in my house. So we did already have that. I worked in a school at the time that provided teachers with one-to-one devices. But on top of that, I had my own device anyway. So I was able to kind of multitask and do different things at once. We could get food shopping delivered. We tended to do that anyway. The UK at this point introduced furlough. So my mum, thankfully, was able to stay home from her job for a while during that time, but my dad wasn't. And so I think it's very important for us to recognize that quite often self-preservation is easier when you are in the higher income bracket, I suppose, because you have more options, because you have more ways to keep yourself safe. For lower income individuals who were still expected to go to work, quite often because they were in public facing jobs that still required them to be open, they were considered the key workers. So the people in supermarkets, the people in restaurants for a long time, hospitality stayed open for quite a long time. And then even when hospitality kind of closed, my sister, who works in pubs, she kind of still provided things to her customers. Like through the pub windows, she was serving food and making sure that the people in her area were being fed. But that, of course, meant that they were exposed. They were at higher risk of getting the disease because they were expected to be out and still working. And quite often, the agency was taken away from them, whether deliberately or not is not my place to say, but we all know how it is. We've done it as teachers. You go in ill because it's easier to do that than it is to prepare a lesson for a supply teacher. But in some ways, that's our agency being taken away from us because we don't feel like we can call in ill because it's a lot of work. We don't have that agency to call in sick, so we go in anyway. But not having that agency actually puts more people at risk because we go in sick and we infect our classroom of 30 kids, and they go home and they spread whatever we've got onto their parents and maybe their siblings who go to a different school. And so that goes around a different school. And, it's that lack of agency, that lack of ability to say, actually, no, I don't want to expose myself to that. That takes away our ability for self-preservation. It's there in the word self-preservation. That ability to make a decision for yourself to keep yourself safe. Now, there are two sides to this coin, aren't there? Because we are a very kind of community-driven society, we do rely on the work of other people so that our lives can function easily. We rely on the supermarket workers to go into work so that the supermarket can be open, so that we can go and buy our food. Parents quite often rely on schools being open and there being a full staff body so that they can drop the children off, so that they can go into work, so that whoever is relying on them can get whatever service they need. And, this interconnectivity is a very good thing. It does ultimately make our lives easier because it means that we're not all having to grow our own food and supply our own electricity and all of that sort of thing. But at the same time, it does make it that little bit harder to have that agency, to have that ability to say, no, actually, I need to preserve myself right now because we are very likely to go into work with a cold. So self-preservation in this case is kind of the opposite of self-care, because self-preservation is almost hindered by an infrastructure, because the infrastructure requires you to be in your place, whereas self-care needs that infrastructure. Self-care needs somebody to be able to pick up the slack for you because you're not feeling too good, and so you're going to take some time off to recover. And that's one of the key differences, I think, between the two, is that self-preservation is inherently about the self. It's about keeping the self alive, whereas self-care is about being able to get yourself back to your best self. How many times can I say self in one sentence? But like, people are kind of willing to invest in other people's self-care because they know that they will benefit from somebody else being at the top of their game. Whereas it does seem much more difficult to invest in someone else's self-preservation because ultimately there may be a cost to us for helping with that.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads. no distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. eduflix.com.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly, face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering math circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
Another interesting and unexpected, from my point of view, conclusion of the 2021 study into self-preservation was that there was a gender divide. The study suggested that women were more likely to engage in self-protective behavior than men were. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. I think, again, if we remember the context in which the study took place, we remember that a lot of construction work was still happening. You know, for a little while, it was considered that because construction happens outside, because the constructors, the builders, they can maintain distance, it was considered okay for a little while for infrastructure work to still take place, which meant that because that tends to be a typically male profession, it skews male in terms of its demographic, there were more men going out to work. Whereas because of the way our society is set up, if you have got families with very young children, it's likely that the stay-at-home parent is a woman, again, not always, but most often. And so, you know, maybe we had a lot of families who already had a stay-at-home mum who was already in a good routine of staying home with the baby, who kind of knew what she was doing in terms of staying at home and functioning from home. And so, of course, then when the study took place, these things were being reported as self-care or self-survival activities, when in fact it was just her daily life. But the other thing that I think is very important for us to recognize is the feminine labor of survival and the feminine labor of care. Women in Western society tend to carry the emotional and physical labor of care. And there is the belief, which I myself adhere to, that, you know, you can't pour from an empty jug. So in order to care for somebody else, you have to also care for yourself. So, you know, while you do get the kind of martyrdom of people liking to talk about how much they care for other people and will sacrifice for themselves. A trend that I've noticed kind of anecdotally on social media is that when you get people talking about self-care, and when you get people talking about, I've got to make sure that I'm okay so that everybody that I'm looking after is okay, those people do tend to be women. Now, again, there are demographic reasons for that. I think generally social media as an occupation does tend to skew heavily female. And so, you are going to get more women in these spaces talking about these things. And so it's going to look like more women do them. But where women are expected to take care of people, it does kind of stand to reason that they would apply those standards to themselves. And what I think is really important there, actually more than what I've just talked about, more than what the conclusion is the recognition of emotional care as a labor, and the fact that it is a job caring for other people, either emotionally or physically. It is a job, it is a responsibility, and it takes a toll, just like everything does. And so recognizing that, and recognizing the extent to which self-care and self-preservation kind of play into those ideas, I think is incredibly important as we look at the distribution of responsibility and support. Something that was quite cool, not necessarily interesting, but that I thought was quite cool, was how the second study, the 2021 study, framed self-preservation as an act of resistance or rebellion. Now, I don't know how I feel about kind of anti-establishment resistance and rebellion always being framed as a good thing, always being framed as being cool. Because let's be honest, it is. In every piece of media that has some kind of establishment, our protagonist is always the one fighting against it, and it's always a good thing that they're fighting against it. And I don't know how I feel about that, but where there is this common perception that rebellion and resistance is a cool thing to do, framing self-care and self-preservation in that way, I think is incredibly important. So it was quite interesting to me that that the 2021 study did begin to frame it in that way, and it kind of suggested that where certain people were increasingly expected to still go out and interact with people, where our frontline workers, our doctors, our nurses, our supermarket staff, our for that period where as teachers we were still expected to be in school so that schools could be open for the children of the frontline workers. So for a little while, us as teachers as well, where that expectation to go out and continue to interact, even though we were constantly being told that it wasn't safe to go out and be around other people. If you took your agency, if you reclaimed your agency, and if you were able to self-preserve and to self-care during that time, it was a radical act of defiance, because it was a case of saying, all right, you were telling me that I still need to go out and work while telling me that it's not safe to do so. Okay, I will do that, but I will also make sure that I am okay, because I will value myself in a way that you, the people telling me that I still need to go out, are clearly not valuing me. And if we're very, very honest, we as people, we're not valued by everybody. We don't have to be valued by everybody. We shouldn't be valued by everybody. It doesn't really matter if we're valued by everybody, as long as we know by whom we are valued, and we make sure that those people are our priority. That's what's important. But by saying I value myself, and so even in the face of these instances where I don't perceive that I am being valued, I am still going to take care of myself. I'm still going to fight to be safe and well. That is an act of resistance. That is an act of rebellion. And do you know what? I think I've kind of convinced myself that that's quite cool. So, and I've discussed this on the show before, we quite often see self-preservation and even self-value as being arrogant, as being something that we don't particularly in British society, where we still have our class system, where we still don't like this idea of rising above your station. To believe that you matter, to believe that you are important, it's not always looked on favorably. But actually having that belief, and not just having that belief, but acting on that belief by making sure you survive, by making sure you take care of yourself, that is a very powerful, very cool thing for a person to do. And I think on that note, we will finish for today. I hope you have found something of value in today's show. For me, what I am taking away, I think, from the research, again, bearing in mind that it was conducted in a very specific time in our lives, in very specific locations, about very specific things, is that self-preservation is just as important as self-care. And I think the way that I want to define self-preservation going forwards is through the reclamation of agency and the understanding that my life is important just because it's here, that, we all have a right to be important by the fact that we exist. Which is not to say, of course, that we will now need to go out and become hedonists because we exist. We have responsibilities just as much as we have rights. And, the fact that I'm here means that I should contribute to society because I benefit from other people's contributions to society. But it also means that just my very presence is important, and I need to make sure that I am well preserved and well looked after. And ultimately, the only person who can do that for me is myself. So that's the lesson that I'm taking away, and I hope that you're taking away something very similar too. We'll check in next week and we'll see how everybody has done with their self-preservation and self-care in this last week before half term. I do hope that you all have a great week coming up. I will see you next Saturday morning, all being well with the technology, although this show has gone oddly smoothly, so we can keep our fingers crossed that everything's going to be okay for next week. I will see you then. Until then, thank you very much and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.